Jeff Tkach, how are you? Thanks for being here.
Jeff Krasno, it is an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we've had an intertwined relationship. So, what a pleasure to be able to actually spend some time in a conversation that's documented because we've had others that haven't been. So, good to see you. Um, all right, so there's myriad interrelated topics that I want to unpack in this conversation. And I sense that it will become abundantly clear over the next 45 or 50 minutes that our intensive conventional agriculture system is failing humanity on, on many levels and contributing to um, a variety of existential issues, from global warming to the degradation of soil and arable lands, deforestation, biodiversity, kind of this odd simultaneous phenomena of famine and obesity. Obviously, its relationship to human health and chronic disease and malnutrition, and then obviously also the socioeconomic components of it, from the collapse of family farms and local economies. And sadly, the list goes perilously on from there. Um, but fortunately, there is a solution to many of these issues that has become your life's work.
Yes.
And that solution might be hidden right under our nose or feet in this particular case. So,
Yeah.
um, but I suppose before that great reveal, maybe you can scaffold our conversation just in some background on the Rodale Institute and the focus of your work there and what inspires you to bring your best self to that work.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for setting it up in that way because there is a lot to be hopeful for, and we're going to unpack all of that over the next few minutes. The Rodale Institute is widely known as the global leader in regenerative organic agriculture. We're a 75-year-old nonprofit research and education organization. Our headquarters are here in eastern Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia and southwest of New York City. But we're actually now operating at 8 locations across the United States, and our whole mission is to do the necessary research that would equip and empower farmers all over the world to move away from chemical dependent farming towards embracing regenerative organic agriculture. So we're a team of scientists, and then of course we're also a team of educators who then push all that science out into the world and literally hold the hand of farmers as they make this most noble leap over to from conventional to organic approaches to farming.
Yeah, and I have recently consumed the more recent white paper that you guys have published, which is brilliant
Mm,
on on regenerative farming and its relationship to soil. And I think we'll get there quickly. But perhaps just at the beginning, you can outline some of the principal techniques that have been commonly used in conventional farming and what are the detriments to those techniques and I suppose any benefits to the degree that there are some.
sure. Yeah, at Rodale Institute, we believe in using biological methods to agriculture. It's basically working with nature and not against it. Now have a team of consultants that are literally on farms all day, every day across the United States. We're now working with over 250 farmers over the last that have signed on over the last 18 months to transition to regenerative and organic methods of farming. And what we're saying to those farmers is, you have everything you need right on your land to empower the best outcomes. And in conventional chemical approaches to farming, they're very reliant upon chemical methods. So using chemistry instead of biology, they're bringing inputs onto their farms and into their systems, and really treating symptoms as opposed to looking at their farm as a whole system. So I would say that in regenerative organic agriculture, we're treating the farm as a whole system, working with nature and not against it. In chemical conventional farming, we're looking at symptoms and then treating those symptoms using synthetic methods, often encompassing heavy tillage, heavy herbicides, heavy pesticides, and really lacking biodiversity in those systems.
Got it. So you're moving from monoculture to more crop rotation and diversity, moving from synthetic fertilizers to more natural organic herbicides and insecticides, or natural fertilizers. And we'll get to herbicides and insecticides, because that is a question that I think a lot of people have in the transition. Is like, how do we manage? How does a farmer manage that transition? Um, but and I hope that you can address that, because I think that is key to potentially a lot of fear that might be associated with that transition. Um,
Yeah.
but maybe you could also touch a little bit about on some of the other outputs of conventional farming, particularly as it relates to greenhouse gas release, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, etc.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And at Rodale Institute, we're really espousing like three main pillars to regenerative organic agriculture: a focus on soil health. And we do that by using crop rotation, complex crop rotations, making sure that we're not planting the same thing year after year after year. Number two, we're encouraging farmers to plant cover crops. These are multi species plants that get planted in between your cash crops to build fertility in the soil, to increase biodiversity of both above ground and below ground. And then lastly, we're using compost. That's something that Rodale Institute has been practicing and espousing for a long time. So compost, cover crops, crop rotations, and then of course working with the farmer to reduce tillage. In conventional agriculture, farmers are very reliant upon tillage as a way to control weeds. They're also using a lot of synthetic pesticides to control bugs, and herbicides to control weeds, and those ultimately end up in our water and in our air. But more importantly, Jeff, is, we're finding that in chemical conventional approaches to agriculture, we're really degrading the soil. And so at Rodale Institute, our founder J.I. Rodale said, actually all the way back in 1942, he wrote the words literally on a chalkboard where he said, "Healthy soil equals healthy food equals healthy people." So that's been like our mission statement for over 70 years. It's been the guiding work of our Rodale Institute. And what we're ultimately saying there, in that, I think what J.I. Rodale was actually saying in those words, is that our job as farmers isn't to produce food. What I actually think J.I. Rodale was saying is that our job as farmers is to produce healthy people. And so in those words, what we're saying is we need farmers to focus all their efforts and energies on improving the health of the soil. And if we do that, we're going to see human and planetary health outcomes unlike any other time in human history. So it's really a paradigm shift right now. We're working with farmers to point towards the soil and not the plant, towards the soil and not the chemical inputs. And if we do that, then everyone's going to win.
Yeah, the connection that you seem to be making between farming and health is one that I think has been often overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's the great quote, "Let food be thy medicine."
Yeah.
However, farmers do not seem to be paying a tremendous amount of attention to human health, and doctors do not seem to be paying great attention to agricultural practices. And
Yeah.
in a way, how I often categorize the work that you're doing is kind of meta level systems design,
Mm-hmm.
where you're thinking about these things almost as a set of intertwined philosophical principles.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe you could unpack that, pull that thread just a little bit in terms of how um, soil begins to degrade, lose its nutrients, the impact that has on the food we eat, and then the health outcomes that we're seeing.
Absolutely. And I'll say, before I answer that question fully, that Rodale Institute does not see itself as a agricultural focused organization. We actually consider ourselves a human health organization. We just are using soil health as the tool to get there. So, um, actually looking out into our future as an institution, we see ourselves as a convener. And we're working behind the scenes right now on some very exciting programs that will launch over the next few months and years that will get medical doctors and farmers to sit at the same table. We
Mm.
want to convene a conversation around the intersection of agriculture and human health, as evidenced by the recent white paper that we put out last year called The Power of the Plate, where we actually wrote a scientific white paper authored by doctors and farmers, and we believe that we're living at a very critical moment in human history where we need to where we've seen this sort of 70-year march away from uh, agriculture, where consumers have become more and more disconnected with source, with where their food comes from, and how that food was produced. And if you go back 70 years ago during the World War II, some 45% of all the produce put on people's plates in this country came from our own backyard. So almost 50% of all the produce in this country consumed during World War II was coming from our own backyards. Today, some 17% of all the food in the grocery store aisles comes from other countries. Concurrent to that, we've seen, in a paralleled collapse in human health, we've seen chronic disease epidemics of great proportion. We're now spending twice as much on healthcare than we are on food in this country. $3.2 trillion on healthcare every year. So we really we're living at a moment where Rodale Institute is working to reconnect agriculture and human health. We need doctors and farmers becoming more literate with one another. I actually have borne witness to this in my own life, Jeff. And I think you and I caught up a little bit about a month ago, and I was sharing with you how my own health collapse ultimately led me to do the work I'm doing today.
Mm.
About 4.5 years ago, I felt ill. Like you remember, I mean, I was a high performing business leader. I was an athlete, a husband, and one day got sick. And there was no explanation, why I felt ill. It was 7 days, 10 days, 14 days. I wasn't getting better. And I started getting nervous. And I went to a general practice doctor at the local hospital, sat in his office, told him my symptoms. He sent me home to rest. He thought it was the flu. Um, that went on and on for about 90 days, where it was back and forth to his office, 6 different specialists that he sent me to, all kinds of blood work. No one could explain my health collapse. He finally sent me home with a prescription to an antidepressant because he blamed my health collapse on stress. So now I'm home on medical leave and had to do something. And a good friend of mine, suggested that I seek out a functional medicine doctor. Found a doctor several miles from my home, sat down with him. He kept me in his office for 2.5 hours that day and asked me all kinds of questions, ran his own diagnostics, and ultimately found that I had chronic Lyme disease. And he
Mm.
said, Jeff, at this point, you're several months into this ordeal. I don't have a prescription to write to you. I don't have a pill that's going to make you better. And I said, well, how am I going to heal? And he said, well, you understand agriculture a little bit anyway. We're going to basically farm your body back to health. We're going to heal you from the soil up. And I swear to God, that's how the conversation went. And over the next few months, my doctor, who's still my doctor today, he got me back to full health. It was in that dark, depressing moment where I decided when I got better, I was going to leave my former career in the media industry to give the rest of my life to this work. And it was really that understanding that helped me to see how fundamentally broken both our agriculture and our healthcare systems are, and how parallel their brokenness is, where that doctor wasn't looking to treat a symptom with a prescription, or a farmer is often left with treating a pest with a insecticide. We're trying to redefine agriculture and healthcare using these regenerative systems based approaches. So that's really at the corner. That's really a hallmark to the work of Rodale Institute, is treating farms as biological systems.
Mm. Yeah, so much to unpack there, and thank you for sharing that story. And I apologize for making you do media today. But it's I think it's not the kind that will stress you out, hopefully.
Not one
Um,
bit.
but I think your personal story is representative of a larger cultural story here. We have um, become a country dominated by kind of monocrops, corn and soy, wheat. I think 90% of our corn and soy are genetically engineered. A lot of it is being grown for animal feed, but also a tremendous amount for synthetic sugars like high fructose corn syrup, which then I think, I read a statistic that if you walk into the supermarket, about 80% of the food on the shelves has some kind of added added sugar. And then, of course, you don't have to make a big leap to see the connection between that and rates of diabetes and pre-diabetes that are just absolutely staggering. I think last I read, the rate of obesity in the United States is somewhere around 43 or 44%. And of course, this is connected in so many different ways. Even if you look at COVID, one of the greatest indicators for aggressive COVID, hospitalization and fatality, are these comorbidities, like diabetes or obesity. And there's a high correlation between BMI and COVID fatality. So these things are extremely interwoven. Um,
Yes.
and you guys are looking at it from an absolutely important holistic perspective. I guess the other big elephant in the room is just climate change in all of its permutations. So perhaps you could take a moment to talk about the utility of of, of focusing on soil
Hmm.
for carbon sequestration and to create those carbon sinks and the scalability that offers us
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah, there's a seminal study that has been running for 40 years at Rodale Institute. It's actually the longest running side by side comparison of conventional and organic grain crops in the world. So there's no other
Mm.
study that's like it that's run for 4 decades. It's called the Farming Systems Trial. It started in 1981 actually. Um, Robert Rodale, our founder's son, was the leader of the Rodale Institute in the 1970s. He was very active in the food industry, and there was a number of leaders in the food industry that were all getting together and watching what was happening. It was around the time when the word organic was coming into vogue, and food brands, food marketers were beginning to put that word on product, but it wasn't really defined under a standard, an accredited standard. And so Bob Rodale was going back and forth to Washington, D.C. with some other food leaders, lobbying our federal government to create a federal standard around the word organic. And as you can imagine, he wasn't met with much fanfare. He essentially got laughed out of the room and sent back. And basically, they said to him, Bob, great idea. We totally see where the market is going, but there's never been science done to prove that organic agriculture is even a real viable production method. So Bob Rodale goes almost to prove a point, comes back to Pennsylvania, uh, starts self funds a 12-acre study called the Farming Systems Trial, which is basically where we set up a system replicating conventional farming. So if you drive around the United States, you mostly see corn and soy production at scale. He basically is comparing that kind of agriculture using synthetic pesticides and herbicides with organic and biological methods. So we're growing corn, soy, oats, wheat, rye in sort of this complex rotation over 40 years. Well, 9 years into the study, it's now 1990. Um, our federal government looks at the data coming off of this study after 9 years and saw that organic systems were actually outperforming conventional farming in terms of yields. So we were out yielding conventional, especially in years of drought or extreme rain. We actually saw as much as 31% increases in yields in the organic systems, while using 45% less energy, while storing more water in the organic systems at deeper depths, while sequestering way more carbon. And by the way, the farmer was earning between 3 and 6 times more profit in the organic system. So 9 years into this, that's when our federal government passed the National Organic Production Act. And by 2002, we began to see the organic label on shelves all across the United States. But that study has really been capturing data for 4 decades that is actually showing, and this was evidenced in our most recent white paper, that regenerative organic agricultural systems, if they were to be rolled out on U.S. farmlands, could sequester all of our world's carbon emissions in the soil where they belong. So we've actually proven through science that regenerative organic agriculture is the solution to climate change, and that we as consumers can play a role in that simply by what we put on our plate 3 times a day. We actually vote for the kind of world we want to live in. And by the way, I think it's important to mention, Jeff, that this one study has been replicated at 5 other institutions, including the USDA, Iowa State, University of Wisconsin. There's several other universities and our own USDA who have also replicated the farming systems trial and have seen very similar results. So this is powerful research that's being done across the United States and having conclusive evidence that is showing that organic farming is more superior to conventional.
Yeah, that's really just incredible news, because I think one of the some of the reticence that farmers have is that Roundup Ready crops or BT corn are more reliable and higher yield. And with an organic or regenerative farm, there's this huge learning curve in terms of managing soil nutrients without chemical fertilizers and tackling weeds and insects without herbicides and insecticides, and the learning curve is so steep that they can't overcome it. But it sounds like you're here to kind of bust that myth. And so I guess I'd ask you, how do you approach farmers, particularly in a very polarized political environment? How do you approach farmers and say, like, hey, no, this transition is actually going to yield, is going to give you greater yields and a more profitable farm?
Yeah. Well, we start by meeting them right where they are. Rodale Institute, our approach, our consulting approach is never to be dogmatic or preachy, but rather to meet the farmer exactly where they are and say, let's take this journey together. First of all, those results that I share with you, Jeff, they didn't happen overnight. In fact, in the early years of the farming systems trial, the conventional systems actually outperformed organic. But you have to
Mhm.
look at the 40-year average and to really see the whole story. It's biology. Biology takes time to play out. It doesn't happen in 1 or 3 years. It happens over 30 years. But my point, our point is to any new farmer that raises their hand and says, "I want to transition my operation to organic," we say, "Okay, let's start where you are, and let's start with the soil. Let's build a farm systems plan." And by the way, we're not going to start with corn in year one because corn is a nitrogen feeder. So if you asked your soils to, oh, by the way, we're not going to give you any more synthetic nitrogen. We're going to cut that off cold turkey. And by the way, to the soil, we still want you to grow corn. It's like, no, the soil's not going to do that. So we're going to introduce a biological system of crop rotation that is going to build the soil. So you might start with a cover crop. You might start with hay. You might start with soybeans because soybeans are nitrogen fixers. We might work hemp into the rotation. So we're going to work with the farmer on a plan that's going to lead them to profitability without taxing their soils. And so there is a very methodical approach that our consultants take.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're also helping to facilitate some of the partnerships that farms may need with food providers in order to give them some stability, particularly over those first few years. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because you know I suppose some kind of more fringier elements of the organic movement have kind of shunned some of the big food providers and castigate them as sort of evil big food, and in some cases they've had certainly deleterious impacts on the food system. But you seem to be trying to reach your hand across that chasm and work with
Yeah.
folks. Is that right?
We have to. Yeah, we have to. I know Rodale Institute is working with the largest food companies in the world right now. And we have to. And we're not going to waver on our mission. We are not going to bend on our ethics or our efficacy. But we will work with any partner that desires to transition land from chemical conventional approaches to farming to these regenerative and organic. We have to. There's too much at stake not to. And so we have recently announced some major partnerships with major food companies. If people ask me all the time, Jeff, like what are the barriers to adoption? If all that science is true, then why aren't more farmers around the world adopting organic agriculture? there's three major reasons. Number one, we've incentivized bad behavior. A lot of our federal policies with the subsidies and some of the farm bill policies are leading farmers towards bad behavior. So yes, we have some work to do on the policy side, but easier than that, these farmers need markets. They need contracts. If a conventional farmer is going to commit to transitioning to organic, they need to know that the market is going to be there to catch them, that the market isn't going to be fickle. And so we need food brands to be giving long-term contracts to farmers, like 5 to 10 year contracts, to guarantee that farmer that the market's there. And then the second is technical assistance. Up until this point, there's no place for farmers to go to get advice. Most of the land grant universities have been in many ways co-opted by big ag that funds a lot of these extension offices. So if a farmer historically would go to the land grant university to get advice, like here in Pennsylvania, it's Penn State University, not to pick on them, but a lot of these big land grants, you can't get the knowledge and technical assistance. But now Rodale Institute is actually offering free consulting to any farmer in the state of Pennsylvania, because we have a very progressive governor here. We're the number 2 producer of organic food in the nation, and our state governor wants farms to transition organic. So he's giving free consulting to farms through Rodale Institute. So now, and we want to roll that out across other states. We're hoping to scale that across the United States. So now you've got long-term contracts, you've got technical assistance, and then the third piece is lending. A lot of banks are very risk averse. They've traditionally and historically been risk averse, but we're beginning to see new lending institutions like Rabobank announce ag lending for organic transition. So it almost feels like, Jeff, like we're living at like our time has come. Like we're living at a moment in history where the stars are aligning. The markets are beginning to form around organic transition. There's certainly consumer demand that's at an all-time high, and so we're living at a very exciting time. And I think what I want your listeners to understand is they actually play a role in this. Every consumer votes 3 times a day based on what they decide to put on their plate. So if we can engage consumers in this movement to vote with their dollar, to support farmers in their community that are growing food in harmony with nature, using regenerative and organic and biological processes, and supporting those farmers, we can actually begin to single-handedly play a role in accelerating the adoption of regenerative organic farming.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could also address the mythology surrounding regenerative farming's ability to actually feed a planet that is careening towards 10 billion residents. And there seems to be a confusion here between famine and food shortage, and really kind of bifurcating those things. I mean, I've read statistics about wealthy countries wasting upwards of 40% of our food, both at the retail and consumer level. I think both play a part in that. And then obviously in more developing countries, there seems to be lack of some infrastructure in the dissemination or distribution of food. So I wonder if you could just tackle that main issue of, can regenerative farming feed the world?
Our response at Rodale Institute would be, how could it not? Sitting on 4 decades of data that has been replicated around the United States, there is no question that organic farming systems can yield or out yield conventional agriculture. That has been proven through science. Secondly, our newest study here at Rodale is called the Vegetable Systems Trial. So this is actually the first side-by-side comparison in the world that sets out to answer the question: is organic food truly more nutrient dense? Is it worth the price premium? Is organic food for real? And so this vegetable systems trial is the first study of its kind that is comparing organically grown and regenerative organically grown vegetables to conventionally grown. And what we're finding through this science is there is this phenomenon called hidden hunger. So you're absolutely correct in everything you just said. Well, there's no shortage of food, certainly in this country. But what's lacking is nutrients in that food. We are walking around as a society with hidden hunger. We are overfed and undernourished because of how we've managed our soils. Over the last 40 years, through the application of synthetic pesticides and herbicides, we have so decimated, so depleted our soils from vital nutrients that We are a country that is eating food, but the food is devoid of vital nutrients. And so we at Rodale Institute have proven that misnomer that organic can't feed the world. That's simply not true. What we all should be concerning ourselves with is the food we are eating uh, filled with the vital nutrients we need to survive as a species. Some early data coming out of our vegetable systems trial. So we send all of our samples off to a third-party laboratory to be analyzed and to be verified, so that the science can be peer reviewed. And some samples were sent off to a laboratory last year. Purple potatoes that were grown organically and purple potatoes that were grown conventionally. And the samples were sent to a very sophisticated laboratory in the Midwest. And I was having a conversation with one of the scientists at that laboratory shortly after the data. Now, this data that I'm about to share is not published or peer reviewed yet, but early analysis is showing that there were 26 compounds, phytonutrients, micronutrients, amino acids that existed at rates of 100 to 700 times higher in the organic purple potatoes than in the conventional. That data is
Mm.
only coming off of land that's been transitioned. That study is only 4 years old. So can you imagine,
Wow.
Jeff, where are we going to be in 40 years if we're getting that much of a disparity in the organic crops versus the conventional after only 4 years? My gosh, like there's something seriously wrong with the way we're producing food in this country.
Yeah, and I've got to imagine that's all tied back to the nutrients in the soil, right?
It's
Um,
all tied
the,
back to how are we managing the soil. Correct.
yeah. So the hydrology of the soil, the microorganisms that are able to effloresce in the soil that then can help to produce healthier vegetables. And I guess I got to ask you, are we even growing vegetables? Because because when I drove cross country, as I did many times in my younger days, um, was a lot of cash crops, and of course, that's not vegetables are probably not going what you're going to see from the highway. But I am curious if you can answer that question.
Yeah, we're most of the food in this country. I mean, for example, Rodale Institute recently opened a campus in Iowa because we're trying to solve number one. Iowa is the largest commodity producing crop state in the country. So, Iowa grows a lot of corn and a lot of soybeans. However, if you're a resident of Iowa, Jeff, you can't buy organic. It's very difficult to find organic food. So Iowa, which is a farm and ag state, is actually a food desert. And so Rodale Institute has set up a satellite campus there with two main objectives. Number one, we want to impact positively the grain farmers that are producing conventional corn and soy. A lot of that corn and soy goes to industrial and ethanol purposes. So, the soybeans go to make ink, the corn goes to make ethanol, and the residents of Iowa are undernourished. And we're trying to change that. We want to create pathways for farmers to begin growing regenerative organic vegetables in that state simultaneously while we regenerate our soils through a new way of farming grains. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. We produce a lot of commodity crops in the United States, and we're becoming more and more reliant on importing our vegetables into this country. What happened last spring? We have a pandemic, and the grocery store shelves went bare. Well, that's because we're so reliant on a global supply chain. Yet, would you believe that last year the National Gardening Association reported that 22 million new gardens were planted in the United States last year? Direct farm sales. So consumers trying to buy produce directly from farmers in their community increased by 420% year over year. So sadly, it took a global pandemic to accelerate positive change. But the silver lining in it all is that I think consumers are waking up to the fact that we are an undernourished society. We have an immune system problem in this country, and if we're going to empower human health, we need to build relationships with farmers. We need to begin growing food in our own backyards. And so I think we're living at a very hopeful time. I think a lot of positive change is coming.
Yeah. Um, well, that is heartening to know that the demand is there, right?
Yes.
Uh, I wanted to take a moment and probe a little bit at the role of meat in regenerative agriculture or biodynamic farming. And I suppose at a meta-societal level as well. I've
Hmm.
recently read that more meat was consumed in 2019 than in any year in history, even though there does seem to be a growing awareness about some of the health implications of meat and the the lack of sustainability of the systems around creating meat. But as the the developing world grows, there's just more and more demand for it, and um, this is problematic on many levels. Obviously, there is a massive greenhouse gas emission component with meat, particularly with methane emissions from CAFOs, um, all of the energy inputs that are required to produce 1 calorie of meat. I think I read that there's 9 calories of energy that has to go into producing 1 calorie of chicken. And
Hmm.
that's the most uh, and that's the best. That's the best meat in terms of energy input. Obviously, the overuse of antibiotics, which is creating resistance, disease risk,
Hmm.
animal welfare. You can go down the list
Sure.
of things. But obviously, livestock and the introduction of livestock does play an important role in regenerative farming. So I wonder if you could just take all of that and bracket the role of animals on the farm in ways that you're talking about.
Yeah. One thing I will say right off the bat is animals do not belong in confinement. We talked about Iowa a moment ago, and essentially we have broken a biological system. We've taken all of the animals that were once on pasture. If you think about the buffalo that migrated from Georgia all the way up into Saskatchewan, for thousands and thousands of years, there was sort of that biological process of rumination playing out, and then our livestock industry, we once grazed animals with cropping systems, and now we've totally separated them. We grow grains on conventional farmland, and then we take all the animals and we put them into feedlots. And so that is a fundamental breakdown. And at Rodale Institute, we believe that animals, crops, and livestock belong together. So what we're espousing are integrated systems where you're rotating animals with grain crops, and you're beginning to use animals as a tool to improve soil health. So here at Rodale Institute, we build scientific models. Right now, about 300 yards from where I'm sitting to doing this very interview, there's a fascinating study going on. I believe it's with the University of Wisconsin, where we built a rotation where last year there was corn and other grain crops and leguminous crops grown on several plots of land, where we then pasture raised pork, so pigs, and then the pigs are being rotated with chickens. So what happens is you begin to build this biological symphony where the animals are now rotating through where you were growing grains, and you're improving the health of the soil through rumination. And then the chickens play a role in keeping the parasite load down on the pigs. And so that was the way Mother Nature intended us to grow food, animals and plants together in harmony. Now, are we espousing for meat consumption at Rodale? I think that's everyone's choice. But what we are saying is that animals absolutely, definitively belong in agricultural systems.
Yeah, yeah. It feels like what you're proposing in this transition to regenerative farming feels on one level like very apolitical. And I see it as something that can actually cross political divides in a time that is obviously fraught. Now, obviously, you're also going up against a lot of entrenched interests with significant wallets that are spending lobbying dollars. Obviously, the the gorilla, Monsanto or Bayer, with glyphosate and Roundup Ready crops, etc. Um, how do you navigate this politically, or do you see a socio-political dimension to the work that you're doing?
Jeff, this is something that I've been spending a lot of time contemplating in my own personal life, in my own spiritual life. The way in which I'm about to answer your question, this is my non-scientific answer. But
Okay.
as I look back over history, any great healing that's ever happened on this planet happened around a table. It happened around a meal. And I wonder, looking out in my world that I live in and day out here at Rodale Institute, this is a bipartisan issue. This is a sanctity of life issue. The ability to eat healthy food on a healthy planet is a sanctity of life issue. And what I'm beginning to see literally on a daily basis is that the Midwestern 65-year-old male grain farmer has everything to do with the 28-year-old tech entrepreneur in San Francisco. They are inextricably linked as people because that 28-year-old tech entrepreneur wants to be able to walk into a Whole Foods in downtown San Francisco and see organic chicken or to see organic oatmeal on the shelves. And guess what? That tech entrepreneur is really, really reliant on that grain farmer in the Midwest having a healthy contract from a food producer in order to get that product to market. And so I believe that it is very possible that regenerative organic agriculture will be the great healer of our time. I do believe that we are living at a moment where right and left will come together around a table and
Mhm.
we will reunite around agriculture, and that agriculture will be the great healer of our time. And that's what I'm seeing play out every moment of every day right now. And it's a very, very exciting time to be alive. And it is a non-political issue to eat food produced in harmony with nature.
Hmm. Beautiful. I know that I want to be respectful of your time. I have one last question for you, though. I'm tempted to leave it there on that uplifting message. Um, but I wonder how you see the role of technology interrelated with regenerative farming. Now I know that you guys have. Well, I'll leave it there, and I'll just with one last appendage, which is there a role for bioengineering within the context of sustainable or organic farming?
Hmm. The reason I laughed at that question, Jeff, is because the call I'm jumping to after our conversation concludes is with a product developer to build some technology to support organic transition. So Rodale Institute is very pro technology. Or farmers love technology. In fact,
Yeah.
anything that's going to make their life easier is going to accelerate positive change. We believe there's a tremendous role in technology for record keeping, for farm practices, for soil health management, for regulatory, etc. Do we believe in gene engineering or genetically modified crops? No, we don't. Not at all. But good organic farmers are using satellite and drone technology every day. We're now beginning to introduce robotics and GPS technology. There's all kinds of great technologies out there that will accelerate positive change. We don't believe in technology that's engineered in a laboratory, in other words, under a microscope in a chemistry format. But all else is pretty much on the table, I think.
Hmm. So we've got 100 million acres of farmland in the United States, more or less. Although I see that number decreasing a little bit year over year. How much of that is currently being regeneratively utilized?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. It's probably around 1% right now in the United States, but the acceleration of that change is happening by the minute. Our consultancy that I mentioned to you was not even in existence 18 months ago, and we've now got several 100,000 acres under management and growing. But we're seeing this play out. I mean, multinational food companies are committing to regenerative transition, and we're talking about millions of acres. We just spoke to a farmer down in Argentina last week. It's a family farm that owns 80,000 acres that they want to transition. So we're seeing
Hmm.
dramatic acceleration. It's happening right before our eyes. And economic theorists believe that it's not the tipping point for this movement isn't 50%. It's actually 15%. So
Right.
we're getting close.
And if you are a farmer and you have the means and the interest to transition, how do they go about getting the information that they need to accomplish that?
Sure. From our end, it's very simple. It's just rodaleinstitute.org. You can click on the consulting tab. You'll see a little form you can fill out there. It'll be linked to one of our consultants. They're very responsive. I'd be thrilled to hear from anyone listening to this episode that is interested in connecting with our organization in an effort to help transition. But we're very easy to get a hold of, and we're very eager to work with you.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, I hope that this is just episode one, because there's so much here to talk about. But I'm grateful for your time today, and really for your work. And it's just been a pleasure and honestly inspirational to watch your journey, just personally. So
Yeah.
thanks, man. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
Jeff, thank you so much for this opportunity to come on today, and it's been a real joy to watch our friendship evolve over the years, and for us to reconnect in this way. And I look forward to another opportunity to expand on the conversation.
I'm Jeff Krasno, and welcome to Commune, where every week we explore the ideas, values, and practices that bring us together and help us live healthy and purpose-filled lives. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you'll join us.